Welcome back to our discussion of the chapter on thinking. Language is, as you know, a big part of our thinking and our thought processes. And you might wonder, like, what is language? Language is something that is actually unique to humans. Let's look at the definition. It's an arbitrary system of communication that combines symbols, such as words or gestural signs, in rule-based ways to create meaning. Language is meaningful. It communicates information and ideas from one member of our species to another one. It's an arbitrary system. What do they mean by arbitrary? Well, we all know that this is a phone. Phone is a word. It's meaningful. It means this. But the actual sound, phone, is kind of arbitrary. We could call it something else. We could call it a, and as long as we all knew that, that would be okay. Words are symbols that refer to something specific, that are meaningful, right? So the sound phone is a symbol that means this. Not all language is verbal. There are sign languages. There is some type of gesture that would mean phone in sign language, I assume. I don't speak it. And we use those words or those gestures, we use those symbols in rule-based ways. For me to make a meaningful sentence, like the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, then I have to put the words in a certain order. I can't just have all those words and put them wherever I like, because then it wouldn't mean the same thing. It'd have a scrambled sentence that you couldn't understand. So our understanding of these symbols also follows rules. Now, they're not all ways of communicating our language. Let's say you communicate with your cat, right? It's not using language. Your cat or your dog communicates with you, not using language. But your cat might understand that means come here, right? Or it might understand that your yelling voice means it did something it shouldn't do. Mating displays, a pigeon puffing itself up, a cat hissing, those all communicate something. They're all meaningful, but it's not based on a system of sounds or gestures that are symbols because they mean something specific and we all understand that meaning. So meow is not a word, even though it communicates something. Meow is more like a feeling. Remy said, so sound can be a language. No, because not all sounds form language. I mean, I could hear a truck beeping out there. That means something. It means, hey, I'm backing up, get out of the way. But that's not language. It's communication. There's a difference between communication and language. Language is a specific form of communication where you have a system of rules and meanings. For every word like phone or cracker, right? I can look it up in the dictionary and the dictionary tells me what it means. And all speakers of English get this. Maybe there's some disputes about certain words, right? Maybe some words have more than one meaning. You know, but you get the idea. So not every communicative sound is a language. And then we have entire languages like sign language that are not based on sound at all. It takes a long time for us to learn language. It's learned. We're not born speaking a language. Our parents teach it to us. It's like a very long process. It takes us years to speak fluently in full sentences. Maybe something like 5 years. And language is incredibly important to us as a species. We communicate information, we communicate thoughts, right? We communicate our feelings. It allows us to function socially in a very complex manner. Imagine if we had no language and we just had to hiss at each other. So languages consist of phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and extra-linguistic information. A phoneme is like a basic unit of language, which is just a sound. This is obviously referring to verbal language. I don't know if there's phonemes in sign language, but there certainly are phonemes in spoken language, and these are sounds that you make. So k is a phoneme, th is a phoneme, d is a phoneme, s is a phoneme, sh is a phoneme, even though it's written with 2 letters, because it's one sound, sh. And across all cultures, humans can produce about 100 distinct phonemes. However, each language only uses a subset of them. English uses about, I think, 40. Some as few as 15, some as many as 60. Babies start off making all these phoneme sounds, right? All 100 or so. But as they get older, they drop the phonemes that are not in the language that they hear around them. And in fact, we lose the ability to distinguish them. And so you will always, if you learned, let's say, Japanese or Korean now, you would have an accent because
hey, I'm just coming in to go to the bathroom. I don't know who's in here.
All right, someone's got their microphone
I just got to pee so bad.
Sorry, I don't know where that's coming from.
I just appreciate you didn't log.
Thanks. Okay. Where were we? Okay. Babies will lose the phonemes that they don't hear around them. They stop producing them. And then after a while, like maybe say after adolescence, you would lose the ability to learn them. And so if you spoke a second language, it would always be not like a native speaker, a little bit strangely, because you would miss those phonemes. As an example, some languages don't have the phoneme th. And so second language speakers or those who speak English as an additional language would use some other sound instead, like maybe a d sound. Okay? Or I think d is probably pretty common. Japanese speakers who speak English as an additional language struggle with R and L sounds. They sound the same to them, and they'll mix them up. Phonemes are not a unit of meaning. They're just refer to sounds. That said, I can think of one phoneme that does have a meaning and is a morpheme. If I add the sound to a noun, it pluralizes it. So if I had the word phone, the word phone is a morpheme. It has one unit of meaning, and it's this. I can add another morpheme to it, like to get phones, which means more than one phone. So morphemes are units of meaning. Phonemes are sounds, and in some cases we have a single sound that's meaningful. But typically morphemes are made up of more than one sound. So cup is a morpheme. Now let me give you another word. Let's take the word runners. I look out the window at the ball field and I see runners. How many phonemes are in runners? So Rami says there's 2 phonemes in runners. Are there only 2 sounds in the word runners? How many phonemes are in the word runners? I see runners on the track field outside my window. Rami thinks it's 3. These are sounds. Yeah, so Grace has got it. Or Virginia. It's 5 or 6. Let's see whether it's 5 or 6. So r, that's a sound. U, n sound. I'm wondering if I should count as one sound. I think it is one sound, even though it's spelled with 2 letters. Yeah, so it's 5 because the E and the R make one sound. Okay, and what about morphemes? How many morphemes in the word runners? Seeing a couple of people saying 2. Yeah, Liam's got it. There's 3 morphemes in runners. So 1 unit of meaning comes from run, which is the verb that is to run. And there's the that adding that ER means something. So a runner is a person who is running. And then the S is the 3rd morpheme or unit of meaning because it pluralizes. It means there's more than one of those people out there. Good job. Syntax refers to the rules by which sentences are put together. Every language has a grammar that says something like, okay, you put the S for the plural after the word and not before it. We put adjectives before nouns, that kind of thing. Okay? And when you learn a new language, you have to learn a new grammar. And that can be hard. But there's even more to communication than just the language, right? Than just the grammar and the words. There is communication that is extra linguistic. There is communication that we use while we're using language. So at the same time we're using language, we're also throwing in extra linguistic information. Okay. What do you think that those things? Could you give me an example of some ways that you could communicate with somebody while you're speaking language with them that are actually outside of language, as say phonemes and morphemes? Yeah, your tone of voice. So yeah, body language, movement. So if somebody uses a certain kind of tone to indicate they're speaking sarcastically and they don't really mean it, maybe they mean the opposite. Yeah, expressions convey emotion. Phoenix had an interesting point there about body language. Yeah, and I agree, there's gestures, what's tricky about the term body language is that it doesn't refer to real language. It's almost like a misuse of the term language. So here's an example of body language. Let's say I'm angry and I put my hands on my hips. Okay. Or maybe I stare at you in an intimidating way. And this means that I mean business. However, there are so many reasons that a person might put their hands on their hips. Like maybe they just need somewhere to put their hands. I don't know. Right? Maybe it just feels good for them to do that. Maybe they did it because they saw someone else doing it and they just copied the behavior. If somebody smiles, sure, that's communicative. Like a smile is body language, but a smile can mean so many things, right? It could mean you're happy. It could be a fake smile. It could be a smirk that says it's off, right? It can mean a lot of different things. So body language isn't true language because we infer what it means by taking like a holistic look at the person, but there's no sort of direct mapping of what a certain gesture means. There are some gestures that are body language that have such a universal significance in some cultures that I think they may as well be a nonverbal component of language. Like this means yes, right? And that means no. There might be some other cultures where they don't use those gestures. Apparently, this is extremely rude. I don't know if all cultures have that, but you know what it means in this culture. So in this culture, I would say that this or this is more than body language. There are sort of hand signs that have been incorporated into our otherwise verbal language. We've already talked about different phonemes and how they are in some languages but not others, and how this can throw off second language speakers who are past the point at which their brain plasticity would allow them to learn to distinguish between these phonemes. Interestingly, I've also heard that Western folks who have grown up with Western music, might not be able to hear Eastern music properly because it uses a pentatonic scale that they're not used to and don't hear. I've heard that argument. I don't know if it's true, but it'd be a similar, if it were, it'd be a similar phenomenon to not being able to hear or repeat the phonemes of another language. We've already talked about morphemes, so I'll move on. And we've talked about syntax, which is the set of rules by which we construct sentences. I want to think, look how complicated that is. Okay, so the cat sat on the mat is a really simple sentence. Right, that's simple. But look at this complex grammar that's behind it. It takes a child a few years to learn that. Right? It would be effortful for you to learn that as a second language speaker of another language, and you'd probably get it wrong. Real world language actually can differ from, real world spoken language can differ from written language where we really see the grammar and in every sentence. I have, in my own life, taped some of my professors, and I would have assumed before I looked at the transcript that they were articulate people, and I'm sure they are in writing. I remember being kind of stunned by how inarticulate the transcript was, and I know that there's an AI program, part of this meeting, that is creating an AI transcript that is sort of decently accurate, and I've looked at the transcript and you see my own inarticulateness. I commonly trail off in the middle of the sentence and then use some kind of gesture or tone of voice that finishes it somehow. And we've talked about extralinguistic information, or like the tone of voice and the facial expressions, and they can make a big difference in ambiguous information. Imagine somebody saying stop. Now, they could say that in a way that means stop, or they could say that in a way that means no, keep going. Written language is purely verbal, syntactic, and doesn't contain any of that extra linguistic information. So unless you make a really big point of expressing your feelings, articulating your feelings and your intent, that information is often just missing from an email, particularly from like a text message where you're like not even writing in full sentences. And so if you're dealing with any kind of complex, sensitive issue, it's probably best not to do it through an email or over text. Maybe you do that in a phone call where your tone of voice comes through. A phone call doesn't involve all the extra linguistic information because it can't see your body posture and they can't see your facial expression. So for really sensitive conversations where you're really hoping for a particular kind of outcome, maybe make that an in-person conversation. Now, say you have a language like English. It's not like the however many million English speakers are speaking exactly the same form of English. They are not all using received pronunciation, which is like the Queen's English. King now, I guess. The King's English is a dialect of English that only some people speak who are members of a certain social class in a certain geographic area who have gone to the boarding schools where they teach you how to talk like that. They speak the same language of English as, say, minoritized or racialized communities of English speakers in the United States who speak what's called Ebonics. When we look at the language use of people from economically deprived or marginalized communities, we tend to look at it as like bad English, as uneducated, as using vocabulary or grammar inappropriately, because we're using the King's English as the standard for what English should be. That's not a fair way to look at it. Actually, there are many, many different dialects of English. So there's sort of variants where people use slightly different grammatical structures or words. But with not too much effort, we can still mutually understand each other. So it's not like speaking a completely different language. It's the dialect, the variation of the same language that's used by people from, say, a specific community. So, where you at isn't bad grammar, it's just how a certain group would use grammar. Okay? It's different grammar, different vocabulary. Now, imagine if you were speaking to somebody or trying to communicate with somebody who speaks a completely different language. You don't speak their language, and they don't speak your language. This happens. It's happened many times with colonialism, where you have the English or French or Spanish speaking colonizers who are encountering indigenous groups in the colonized lands. And they don't know each other's languages. What happens in that case is that people actually start to figure out how to communicate. They learn each other's simple keywords, and they develop a kind of simplified grammar. Okay? In much of Africa, people speak a pidgin. That's the word for it. It's not spelled pigeon like the bird pigeon. You can see it's spelled kind of differently, although it sounds the same. And it's a combination of English and the indigenous languages that actually developed with the slave trade that is still used today, spoken in many different parts of Africa. And the BBC News actually has a news service in Pidgin. And you can see how they're using some English words. You can see anger, you can see the word sort of pigs. This looks very unpleasant. And then you can also see that there's other words that are not English, right? Like wetin. You can see that there are English words that are spelt in a more simple phonetic way, like everything or happen. Then there's words that are not English, like marbug. You can see that people is a phonetic way of saying the English word people. I thought that was pretty cool. As I've said, language requires years and a very fancy brain. Okay? Other animals don't have the cognitive capacity for language. Humans are the only animal that have true language. There are people who study the history of language. Etymology can be quite interesting. So if you want to know, why we call this a phone, there's an etymology of the word, there's a history of the word, and it could be, sometimes words are traced back to, in English, could be traced back to, say, Greek or Latin. And in fact, it looks like some languages have a common Indo-European root. Generally speaking, there's an arbitrary connection between the sound of a word like phone and the actual thing itself. But there are some exceptions. Those are called onomatopoetic words. I'm probably butchering how I'm pronouncing that. We have a few words that sound a bit like the thing they're describing. And the thing they're describing is sort of like a sound. So, boom, maybe that sounds like what booms sound like. The word fly has that kind of sound that we associate with something moving through the air. I saw a comment from Lauren about what about dolphins? I think they have a complex language. And what about whale song? I don't really know. And I bet there's a lot of controversy into it. You could look into that. Sometimes researchers argue about whether a system of communication is true language. So you might have, some animals might have specific sounds that mean a certain thing. So vervet monkeys have different calls that mean, hey, there's a lion, or hey, there's a snake. And maybe that has to do with the development of language. So are dolphin sounds true language? I don't know. Do dolphins have grammar? So as I've said before, babies start off learning the phonemes of their language. They start out with all the phonemes. And eventually they drop down to just the phonemes of the language that they hear around them. And when they're doing that, it's like they're figuring out how to use their vocal tracts. And you might wonder, well, right, what about babies that are born to deaf parents who have sign language? Well, they're moving their hands around. Okay, they hand babble. Children learn to recognize words, to understand words before they can produce them. And actually, language comprehension and language production are localized to different parts of the brain. Language comprehension is localized to Wernicke's area. This is in the frontal lobe, I believe. And production is localized to Broca's area. And the comprehension comes first. So a mom could say to the baby, hey, where's the elephant? And the child could point to the elephant toy, but without being able to produce the word elephant. Understanding single words comes around, let's say, 10 to 12 months. And the baby's first words are often those that they hear around them. So words like, mama and dada. Uh-oh. Right, things in their environment. Things their moms say, like done or hi. At this age or early in life, kids tend to overextend or underextend the meaning of words. So they might use the term mama to refer to any woman, not just their mother. Or they might think that the lamp is just the lamp in their bedroom. Kids also start to learn grammar, and they learn it slowly. So they start off speaking at a one-word phase, and then after like another year, they're combining 2 words. And around 3, they're speaking in like kind of a telegraphic speech, like give juice, okay? Or, bad kitty. And again, comprehension precedes production. I've mentioned that not all language is verbal. Are there any sign language speakers in the class? I don't speak sign language, but Phoenix does. Nicholas knows some ASL. Sign language it's very interesting. It's fascinating. And there was so much extra linguistic stuff there as well that was a surprise to me. So once I was hanging out with some deaf folks, and there was an interpreter, and I would do things like look at the interpreter instead of the person who was signing. And I would do something like try to talk to people on the stairwell without realizing that that was rude because it makes them take their hand off the rail. And maybe when people are on the stairwell, they would like to have their hand off. So sign language isn't just, it's more than gestures. Okay, it's a true language, just not spoken and not verbal. It uses the same brain areas. We see the same developmental stages right down to babbling. Interestingly, people who speak sign language only will sign in their sleep, right? Instead of talking in their sleep, right? They'll talk to themselves with their hands instead of muttering to themselves like we might do. There is interesting research on the development of sign language. Nicaraguan Sign Language is the only case in the world of the development of a language where the people who started it are still alive and can be interviewed. Let's say that a deaf child is born to hearing parents who don't speak any sign language. How are they going to communicate? Well, they start using home signs. And maybe they get that, this means give me a cup of water, or, this means yes, and that means stop. You could imagine that these home signs could be pretty similar across a lot of different homes. So maybe there's different families who have nothing to do with each other, but they're all using this to say yes and that to say no. And they come up with similar home signs for some similar things. In the 1970s in Nicaragua, there had been no schools for the deaf, but in the 70s, they started that. And they brought all these deaf kids in who did not speak sign language. and they had teachers who spoke ASL. And something happened where the kids were talking to each other and the teachers couldn't understand. They didn't know what was going on. The children had started communicating with each other, originally using those like home signs, common home signs, and developing their own signs, teaching it to younger students who came in, who then complexified it, and they invented their own fully fledged language, Nicaraguan Sign Language. Isn't that cool? So the originators of this language can still be interviewed because they're still alive. I think that's remarkable. Bilingualism seems to have a lot of benefits, more than just cognitively. Great workout for your brain. And if you are going to learn another language, the earlier the better, in order to better learn the grammar and have a chance of picking up the right kinds of sounds. That said, it's like it's never too late. It's still beneficial for you to learn an additional language later in life. If people are growing up learning 2 languages, they will go through the same stages, but maybe a little bit slower. Speaking more than one language gives people additional levels of insight, because you're not trapped into thinking through the structures of vocabulary of one language. And so you can have maybe a bit of a different perspective. Maybe you can compare and contrast ideas expressed in different languages. And there are a lot of, I forgot to put some stuff on the slide. There are a lot of cognitive benefits to bilingualism. People who are bilingual are more resistant to dementia. Okay? They tend to have higher academic performance. They tend to have better problem-solving skills. And in addition to that, they also there's other benefits, like more cross-cultural awareness, because you can communicate with people in different culture. And they might be able to better maintain family connections. I don't speak Slovak, and so it's very hard for me to communicate with my mother's Slovak family. In a way, I'm almost isolated from them because of the language barrier. I have seen textbooks that take the position that there is a critical period for language development. That if you do not learn any language before puberty, you can't learn it after that. It's too late. And that's based on case studies. There are some very unfortunate, what we call natural experiments. These are things you would never be allowed to replicate or create in a lab, but they do happen out there in the world. So sometimes there are children that are deprived of human contact. Let's say they have very abusive, very neglectful caregivers, and there are feral children who end up being raised by wolves. And there was a video that I might show you if there's time, of an unfortunate case. I think her name was Oksana Mayul, maybe, in the Ukraine, and she grew up acting and sounding and barking like a dog because she was cared for by dogs. When children like Jeannie were found, or children like Oksana, it seems like they can learn language the younger they're found. But when somebody like Jeannie is found and she's 13, is it that she's past the critical period, or is there just so much intellectual disability at this case, at this point, given her experiences? Is she so damaged? Is that really the reason why? So we don't really have enough evidence to firmly say there's a critical period, but sure, there's definitely a sensitive period. We know that even with second language learning. The younger you do it, the more likely you are to fully learn the grammar and the vocabulary and sound like a native speaker. And there's also a general issue of brain plasticity. Before puberty, children's brains just keep making connections, right? Neurons just keep connecting, making more connections. And then at puberty, that dramatically, it doesn't stop completely, but it dramatically slows down, and the brain actually starts pruning off unused connections for the sake of efficiency. And it's harder to form new connections. So, and that applies for anything, right? It's harder to learn to play the piano as an adult. It's harder to learn to figure skate as an adult. And if you do learn those things as an adult, you will never do it as well as somebody that learned to play the piano or to figure skate as a child, when their brains were really plastic and they could make all those connections that are hard for you to make now. There are many different theories and accounts of language acquisition. We'll go through those. The imitation perspective, nativist perspective, social pragmatics view, and a general cognitive processing view. These are different ways to look at language acquisitions. Imitation perspectives say, okay, we learn language by imitating others. Babies hear language around them and they start to copy it and mimic it. Right? They start babbling the phonemes of their native language. That's true to an extent. Yes, it absolutely is based on copying to some extent. When I was teaching English as a second language, I would say a word and I would get the learner to repeat it back and repeat it back until they got it right. They were copying me. So yes, imitation is part of it, but it's not all imitation, because there are strange cases of the generation of new languages. And we saw that with the Nicaraguan deaf children. And there's another interesting phenomenon called cryptophagia. There are cases where twins have generated their own languages. Now, in the period of acquiring that language, they would be copying each other, right? There'd be imitation between the twins. There would be imitation between the signing children, imitation among themselves. But as an adult, if you really wanted to, I think you could come up with your own language that didn't involve imitation. And didn't J.R.R. Tolkien come up with language? With the things he wrote for like the elves and the orcs? He was doing some language generation there. Some people say that we have some innate ability for language. And Noam Chomsky posited that there is a language acquisition device. Somewhere in your brain is a language acquisition device that enables you to do that. This is a hypothetical construct. Nobody has ever opened anyone's head, done some kind of a CT scan, done an autopsy, sliced up the brain, and was like, aha, we found the language acquisition device. So it's a hypothetical entity in the brain, in which people who follow the nativist view would say that your knowledge of syntax, grammar, would be found. It can be hard to falsify. Okay, there's this hypothetical structure. It does these things. How do you test it? There is some support in the idea that language is innate when you look at people's language generation abilities, though. So maybe there's some kind of circuitry we have that other animals don't have. The social pragmatics view looks at the role of the social environment, right? Of reading other people's mental states. So this view would say that what we need, that in order to learn language, we need social cognitive skills. social cognitive skills that allow us to understand the communicative intent of others. So there's more than a language acquisition device that's like, okay, you can understand grammar. You need more than that. So let's say the parent points at the toy and says, elephant. It's an elephant. Is there some other kind of innate ability that allows a human to understand that when I'm looking and pointing at a thing, I'm talking about that thing? That's also a cognitive ability. And you know what? This doesn't work with some animals. I cannot get my cat to look at what I point at. I don't know if it works with dogs. I'm not a dog owner. Maybe our ability to learn language has something to do with our general intelligence. It takes pretty high cognitive powers in order to learn and understand language. Maybe that's a necessary basis. The textbook points out that, as, let's say, children become more and more proficient in languages, they're more cognitively skilled in general, right? A baby or a toddler that speaks in two-word telegraphic speech has much lower cognitive abilities than a 5-year-old that's speaking in full sentences. As a sort of critique to this, they mention that, well, hey, children learn language better than adults, but adults are overall better at learning things. I don't agree with that statement. Children are much faster at picking up things that are appropriate to their intellectual level. I think that an adult would be much faster than a child at certain highly complex things, like learning calculus, like learning rocket science. I don't think at certain ages you cannot teach a child certain things. There's a stage called formal operations, comes in around 12, when kids are able to understand like abstract philosophical concepts that you could not explain to a child at a more concrete stage. So I would say that given an appropriate level of complexity for their intellectual ability, children learn faster than adults. A child will learn to play the piano a lot faster than an adult. Because, and the textbook doesn't mention plasticity. And plasticity is a big issue in learning. Adults have a lot more crystallized knowledge, and they're able to draw on that and build on that in a way that children can't. So I feel like they're mixing up different things. As I've mentioned, we know that language learning is lateralized in the brain. I think it's to the left side. And then there's specific brain areas that seem to be associated with different functions. I've mentioned Wernicke's area for speech comprehension and Broca's area for speech production. And somebody could have a stroke that affects Broca's area and they can't produce language, but they can still understand it. They have a stroke to Wernicke's area and that damages their comprehension, but they're still able to produce it. Somebody who had damage to, let's say, an area of the brain that prevents them from speaking, the Broca's area, they can still sing, because singing, even with words, is based on a different part of the brain. We are at 12:19 now, and I only have a few slides left, but I think I have to let you go. We might have a short class next time. So thank you for your attention, and let me know if you have any other questions.